Greetings, APUSH people. Thanks for joining me. This is Mr. Law back here. We're going to go over the Reform movement and the Second Great Awakening in this video. The Reform movement is oftentimes referred to also as the antebellum Reform movement. So the time period for this is between the 1790s through the 1850s. And the Reform movement was a voluntary social movement that aimed to make change in certain aspects of society. A big part of the Reform movement was the Second Great Awakening. Now, you might remember the First Great Awakening from in the 1700s, but the Second Great Awakening was a period of religious fervor which was inspired by the American Revolution. Many people felt there was a lack of religious zeal in the country at this time. One of the big figures from the Second Great Awakening is a man named Charles Finney. He was a traveling preacher. He was against slavery. He was against alcohol. He believed that people were a moral free agent. He was a big actor in these camp meetings, which were often several days long, and they were religious experiences, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But he also advocated for something called emotionalism. During the Second Great Awakening, there was the birth of distinct black churches as well. Additionally, the Baptist and Methodist denominations grew quite rapidly. People wanted to improve their own lives and society. This is often referred to as perfectionism. Regular people started becoming more active in church, especially women. Certainly something we should think about with the Second Great Awakening is the increased involvement of women in the church. More denominations were formed, as I mentioned, the growing Baptist and Methodist denominations. There were many individual conversions. These were referred to as people being born again, and predestination ended up becoming a rejected religious philosophy as well. The Burnt Over District, or often referred to as the Burned Over District, was in central and western New York, right along the Erie Canal, where religion was particularly inspirational and grew along this region. Very important region to the Second Great Awakening. Many camp meetings, many traveling itinerant preachers set up and did their thing along the Burnt Over District. In the Burnt Over District, the Mormons were established. They were often referred to as the Church of Latter-day Saints, and the Mormons, they're the same people. They set up utopian communities. Two people that we should definitely know when we're talking about the early Mormons is Joseph Smith. He was the founder or the prophet. He, because of persecution, moved the Mormons west to Illinois, where he ended up tragically being killed by a mob of people that did not agree with the Mormons. And then Brigham Young took over. He moved the Mormons even further west to Utah, where they set up a utopian society. One of the controversial measures that they had was polygamy, where men would take on several wives. As a matter of fact, their statehood was held up for quite some time because the U.S. government didn't like this polygamy lifestyle. During the Reform movement, there was also educational reform. Now, this was led mostly by Horace Mann, who was known as the father of American education. Emma Willard, she advocated for women's education. Overall, education was expanded. Taxpayer education became larger and more important in the United States during this time period. What was the purpose of education? Basically, many thought the purpose of education was to instill Republican values in children to get them ready to live in a Republican society, especially the boys. Increased tax-based schools started popping up, mostly in the North, but in other parts of the country as well. Provide discipline and math and reading skills were the focus. That if you were going to work in a factory or you were going to be a boss, you need to have reading and math skills. Another purpose of education was to assimilate immigrants. So in other words, to Americanize the children of immigrants so they can play a more, quote, meaningful part in American society. Another reform during this time was to mental illness and also to prisons. Dorothea Dix certainly should be someone that we think about when we think about mental illness and prison reform. She traveled the country and documented the horrific conditions in many American mental illness facilities and prisons. In many cases, people with mental illness were simply put in jail with criminals. So much of her work led to the growth of professional psychiatric institutions and help for those in need. The temperance movement was another big function of the reform movement. It was a slow push towards the prohibition, which would take place later on in American history. And it especially focused towards men and immigrants. In the United States, drinking and alcohol was a very big problem. And the motive for this temperance movement was that the factory system would work better if people weren't drunk or hungover at work. Also, domestic violence was a problem. There was a lot of violence between husbands and wives and abuse of children. So domestic violence was a big thing. Another thing that a lot of Americans were concerned about was that many of these immigrants from Germany and Ireland came from a culture where alcohol was a big part of it. The American Temperance Society of 1826 was probably one of the biggest organizations in regards to the temperance movement. Lyman Beecher, who would be Harriet Beecher Stowe's father, was very active in this, and they boasted as many as 1 million members of this, and they encouraged men to take pledges to their family and to their community that they would no longer drink, and they had what was called a, quote, dry message. In 1851, there was a law passed in Maine which outlawed the production and sale of alcohol. The abolition movement, meaning the abolition of slavery, was probably the most profound and effective movement during the reform movement. The American Colonization Society, which was a group which ended up wanting to send freed slaves to Africa. And there were about 12,000 freed slaves that were sent back to Africa by this American Colonization Society. Now, a lot of enslaved and freed men and women didn't want to go back to Africa because they viewed themselves, remember, they had been in the United States for generations now. They viewed themselves as Americans, and they just wanted to be free, not sent, quote, back to Africa, because they themselves had never come from there. A couple of key individuals in the abolition movement: William Lloyd Garrison, his publication, The Liberator. He also helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society. Frederick Douglass, this is probably the single most important person from the abolition movement. His book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and the North Star, his publication. He was a freed slave that went on to have an incredible impact on the abolition movement. And both William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, they used the moral argument that slavery was just wrong, it needs to end, and a civilized society had no place for slavery. Also, the women's movement, the cult of domesticity, idealized women in the roles of mothers and wives, also in the same vein as Republican motherhood. Women were expected to raise their children to be good citizens. They were thought during this time that they should bring religion back into the home to protect their kids and their husbands as a safe haven from the cruel outside world. Women were still viewed as second-class citizens, although we know that many women were active in a variety of the reform movements, and especially the women's rights movement. The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 was considered to be the beginning of the women's rights movement. The purpose was to discuss the social, civil, religious, and voting rights of women, oftentimes referred to as suffrage. Some of the key figures: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Frederick Douglass. Yes, that Frederick Douglass was also very active in the women's rights movement. The Declaration of Sentiments and Resolution, very similar language to the Declaration of Independence, was ratified. In it, it stated that all men and women are created equal, as opposed to all men are created equal, which was in the Declaration of Independence. They passed resolutions calling for divorce, custody rights of children, education, and property rights for women. As mentioned before, this event in upstate New York was seen as the beginning of the women's rights movement. Transcendentalism was also something that became very popular during this time. A famous quote: "Truth could be found in nature." You had Emerson, who believed and wrote extensively that the United States needs to create its own culture in art and literature. You had Henry David Thoreau, who was an advocate for civil disobedience and inspired Gandhi and MLK He refused to pay taxes that went towards the Mexican-American War as a sign of civil disobedience. Many of these transcendentalists were very prominent in New England. You also had utopian societies that developed. Now, the Mormons that we talked about earlier, they were considered to be a utopian society, but many of these utopian societies, which weren't as connected to religion as the Mormons, they wanted to create a self-reliant, ideal community that was not chained to the industrial and market revolution. Some examples would be Brook Farm, which was in Massachusetts, and there was also New Harmony, which is kind of at the bottom of the page there, but that was in Indiana. That was a socialist utopian society. All right, folks, here are a couple images from the Reform Movement and the Second Great Awakening. This is a nice picture of Frederick Douglass. We know how important he was to the Abolition movement and also important to the women's rights movement. So here's a pretty famous picture of him from later on in his life. This is a famous picture of women, as you can see, dumping out alcohol and destroying alcohol barrels. We could assume that maybe they were from the American Temperance Society. Again, women were a driving force, not only in the abolition movement, but also the women's rights movement, but also in the temperance movement, trying to help solve the big problem with alcohol in the United States at the time. This is a famous painting of a camp meeting. Something being portrayed like this could occur up in the Burnt Over district in upstate New York. People like Charles Finney in this type of structure could be preaching to hundreds of people, maybe even thousands of people. Sometimes they would last a couple hours. Sometimes they would last days and days. There would be all types of religious happenings that would be happening here. There would be conversions, people being, quote, born again, people testifying to the audience about their powerful religious experiences. This here is a flow chart, which is, I think, a good summary. So the Great Awakening and the Reform movement are certainly tied together. Social reform was born out of the Second Great Awakening. So as you can see, spiritual reform from within would lead to social reforms and redefining the ideal of equity. So the temperance movement, again, pushed towards abolition of alcohol. You also have asylum and prison reform. We could think of Dorothea Dix. Abolitionism, you could think of William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. The women's rights movement, you could think of the Seneca Falls Convention, and then the education reform, Horace Mann, and the increased amount of taxpayer paid for public schools and changes to the education system.